Some warriors march for honor, and others chase the echo of glory. But the Death Korps of Krieg shed blood for something far colder. The faint, almost hopeless chance that millions of deaths might balance a single world's unforgiven crime. In the nightmare millennium of Warhammer 40,000, where war is endless and mercy extinct, there exists one regiment of the Imperial Guard that has elevated self-destruction into a deliberate craft. They are the Death Korps of Krieg, and this is the grim genesis of their legend. Over 15 centuries ago, an entire planet consigned itself to ruin. Krieg had once been a teeming hive world in the Segmentum Tempestus, its billions thriving beneath vast spires and manufactoria. Yet its ruling council of autocrats rotted from within, succumbing to paranoia and corruption until fear of losing power to the Imperium drove them to madness. In 433 M40, the planet's high autocrat openly severed allegiance to the Imperium of Man, proclaiming the Emperor no longer his sovereign and plunging Krieg into a savage civil war. Most of the populace rallied to the traitor banners, save for scattered enclaves that refused to betray the throne. The greatest of these was Hive Farad, commanded by Colonel Jurton of the 83rd Regiment, who bore uncompromising orders: never yield to heresy. As the rebellion consumed the world and imperial relief grew impossible, Jurton made a decision as cold as void steel. If the Emperor could not reclaim Krieg, no one would. Upon the solemn feast of the Emperor's ascension, he enacted his design. With unflinching, some said deranged, devotion, Jurton unleashed the purging, a calculated counterstrike of atomic fire meant to scour Krieg clean of traitors, even if it meant annihilating the planet itself. The counterstrike unfolded as Jurton unleashed Krieg's own hoarded arsenals of atomic fire upon its cities. He quite literally drowned his world in nuclear annihilation to deny it to the foe. For endless days, rolling firestorms of fission scoured the land. Hive metropolises that once glittered with industry became nothing but vast, radioactive craters. The planet's skin was blistered and poisoned, its skies turned to a permanent shroud of blackened ash, a dead world already taking shape. Billions were consumed in the inferno. By any sane measure, it ranked among the most savage acts of war in Imperial chronicles, a calculated planetary suicide. Yet to Jurton, the calculus was simple. A lifeless world loyal to the Emperor was worth infinitely more than one breathing in heresy. When at last the towering mushroom clouds thinned, Krieg was technically loyal again, because nothing remained that could betray. But annihilation was only the beginning. From vaults and deep shelters, the unlucky and the stubbornly prepared clawed their way into a poisoned dawn and continued the conflict. Jurton and his surviving faithful had anticipated exactly this, sealing themselves in Farad's fortresses before unleashing Armageddon. Rebel remnants likewise endured in their own subterranean refuges. What followed was 5 centuries of relentless trench warfare across a world turned to radioactive nightmare. In ash-choked husks that had once been proud cities, the faithful and the faithless ground each other down in an unending contest of attrition. Territory and resources no longer mattered. Everything had already been burned away. Only conviction and the will to fight remained. For more than 5 unrelenting centuries, the Loyalists, sustained by an iron faith in the Emperor, waged a slow but inexorable extermination of the traitors. Foot by foot, tunnel by tunnel, they scoured Krieg of heresy at a price beyond mortal reckoning. The once vital hive world withered into nothing but a vast charnel ground of endless combat. At last, in the year 949 M40, the long nightmare ended as the Loyalists proclaimed victory. Krieg was an imperial world once again, though by then it was scarcely a world at all, only a toxic, irradiated husk, barely capable of sustaining life. From these poisoned ruins, the Death Korps of Krieg arose. Those who had endured centuries of subterranean war emerged hardened beyond comprehension. Their view of existence forever shaped by sacrifice and death. They had given everything to prove their devotion to the throne, and yet their need for atonement burned undiminished. Krieg was a cursed planet now, and its people carried a crushing legacy of guilt and duty. They believed that both they and their descendants survived only on the Emperor's sufferance, living on borrowed time. Recognizing this grim fervor, the High Lords of Terra decreed that Krieg would serve the Imperium in the only way still possible, as a vast manufactory of soldiers. Every remnant of infrastructure and every cultural practice was bent toward that single purpose. By imperial edict, the tithe of manpower was set to the highest level imaginable, and the people of Krieg, fiercely loyal and desperate to redeem their past, embraced the decree without hesitation. Krieg became a death world in the truest sense, not only for the poison in its air and soil, but for the society that hardened beneath it. The planet's surface remained a blasted, radioactive wilderness where unshielded life could not last. To endure, the population retreated entirely underground, inhabiting immense bunker cities and sealed manufactoria, many carved from the very fortifications their forebears had built during the Civil War. In these endless labyrinths of rockcrete and steel, every breath of daily existence revolved around war. There were no true civilians. From the moment of birth, every boy and girl was effectively a soldier in preparation. To sustain the colossal quotas demanded by the imperial tithe, Krieg embraced measures so extreme that elsewhere in the Imperium, they might be branded heresy. Were they not so brutally efficient? Among these were vitae wombs, artificial gestation chambers that accelerated and multiplied births, turning human life itself into a form of mass production. Rigid eugenics programs followed, purging any hint of genetic weakness or mutation, ever a danger on a world saturated with radiation. The outcome was staggering beyond belief. Records claim that each year, more than 50 million new guardsmen are conceived, drilled, and dispatched from Krieg's underground foundries of flesh. 50 million souls yearly fed into the wars of the Imperium. It is an almost incomprehensible harvest of human lives. Yet for an empire whose conflicts are endless, such numbers are simply another currency. On Krieg, every child grows beneath the unshakable doctrine that their only destiny is to fight and to die for the Emperor. Education on Krieg is nothing like schooling elsewhere in the Imperium. It is an unending crucible of weapons drills, survival ordeals, and relentless immersion in the Imperial Creed, the state faith that worships the God Emperor. The slightest sign of doubt or frailty is cut out early, often along with the child who shows it. All instruction unfolds under live fire and real peril, where deaths during exercises are simply tallied as acceptable losses. From childhood, the recruits are driven onto the planet's poisoned surface, forced through live ammo maneuvers, in irradiated wastes and subjected to hardships severe enough to shatter veteran soldiers from more forgiving worlds. The purpose is brutal clarity. Eliminate anyone incapable of facing the absolute nightmare of the front. By the time a young Krieger is judged fit for war, every instinct for self-preservation has been burned away. They are taught that a single life weighs nothing against the Emperor's cause. Each carries the ancestral guilt of ancient treachery, convinced that only a righteous death in battle can cleanse that stain. Their creed is distilled in a battlefield litany whispered before the charge. In life, war. In death, peace. In life, shame. In death, atonement. These These stark words define the Death Korps philosophy. So long as they draw breath, they fight, believing their very existence to be a state of sin. Only in the instant of sacrifice for the Emperor can they find absolution and rest. It is an ideology of extremes, but every facet of the Death Korps is forged in extremity. Such a childhood forges warriors who are, in the plainest words, fanatically unafraid and grimly unyielding. A single Death Korps guardsman will not flinch beneath a storm of fire, will voice no complaint, and will never contemplate surrender. Hardships that would shatter entire regiments elsewhere are simply their daily reality, and mass casualties are accepted as routine, even inevitable. In combat, a Death Korps commander rarely bothers with elegant maneuvers. The core question is brutally direct. Can we bleed more than the enemy before breaking? If the answer is yes, the order is advance. Victory becomes nothing more than a function of time and flesh. Discipline inside the Korps is absolute. Orders are executed instantly and without debate, especially when those commands mean certain death. Personal ambition or the instinct to survive hold no value. Indeed, an excess of self-preservation might brand a Krieger as flawed. Praise and recognition mean nothing. Unlike other Imperial Guard formations, these soldiers will never boast of feats or pose for Imperial propaganda-picked feats. They fight, they fall, and their passing is recorded as a mere entry in a munitorum ledger, soon replaced by the next wave. This anonymity runs so deep that many abandon personal names entirely, answering only to rank and serial number. The very notion of being immortalized as a hero or decorated for valor is foreign to them. To a Krieger, dying in perfect obedience is the highest and only distinction, and anything less would be unthinkable. In the mindset of Krieg, an act others might call legendary, charging a fortified gun nest alone or holding a bunker until every comrade has fallen is not heroism at all, merely the fulfillment of duty. Courage is the baseline. Cowardice is the one unforgivable sin. To outsiders, this makes the Death Korps appear less like soldiers and more like engineered automata. In truth, they almost are. It is no surprise that such an outlook unsettles even their allies. Imperial citizens and battle-hardened guardsmen alike often describe Kriegers as spectral, as if they have already crossed the threshold of death. They keep to themselves, their presence marked by silence and the ever-present gas masks that shroud their faces. Those respirators, with their round, opaque lenses, erase any glimmer of human expression. Necessity dictates this, for Krieg's poisoned air demands constant filtration. But the habit has become cultural. Tales circulate of Kriegers declining to remove their masks, even in secured zones or aboard ships, seemingly more at ease without a visible identity. The soft hiss of their filtered breathing and the unfeeling stare of their goggles create an eerie tension. Conversation is rare and humor almost non-existent. To ordinary troops, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Death Korps is like fighting beside the damned or a legion of the already dead. Warriors who have relinquished everything except the will to obey and to kill. Let us turn to how the Death Korps actually wage war. For claiming they feel no fear is one thing, but witnessing their methods on the battlefield is another. They are masters of siegecraft and the slow, grinding wars of attrition. Picture the mud-choked trenches and tangled barbed wire of the worst 20th century fronts. Then cast that vision into the far future. Add roaring tanks, searing lass fire, and nightmare Xenos, and you glimpse a typical Death Korps campaign. These soldiers thrive in prolonged meat-grinder conflicts that would break other Imperial armies. The moment a Krieger regiment sets foot in a war zone, they begin to dig. Each trooper carries an entrenching tool, little more than a shovel, and wields it with the skill of an artisan. Within hours, a bare stretch of blasted earth becomes a labyrinth of trenches, bunkers, and firing pits, often carved out while enemy shells burst around them. They were raised to burrow in radioactive soil. Digging under bombardment is almost instinct. Patience, too, is their weapon. They will encircle and choke an enemy for months or even years, if that is the price of victory, enduring constant shelling and privation without complaint. Artillery forms the iron heart of their doctrine. They cherish immense guns, mortars, howitzers, earth-shaker cannons, siege mortars, anything that can hurl death across great distances. A Krieg offensive almost always opens with a thunderous barrage that rips the landscape apart before the infantry even rises from its trenches. They hammer the enemy lines relentlessly, day and night, for as long as required, sometimes for unbroken stretches of days, until the very ground is shredded and unrecognizable. The sky becomes a cauldron of shrieking shrapnel, deafening detonations, and clouds of poison. Yes, poison gas. The Death Korps will deploy chemical weapons without hesitation if it grants the slightest advantage. Their own soldiers are, of course, thoroughly prepared. Encased in sealed armor and respirators, they advance through choking fumes and nerve agents as if striding through ordinary mist, while any foe lacking similar protection collapses in spasms, lungs seared from within. To the Kriegers, this is not cruelty, but simply the most efficient way to wage war. Only when the preparatory barrage has wrung every possible effect, blasting craters, shredding barbed wire, smashing bunkers, and rattling defenders to the marrow, does the infantry assault commence, the phase that cements the Death Korps' grim reputation. At the signal, they climb from their trenches and march across no man's land straight into roaring fire, ranks perfectly ordered. They do not sprint or scatter. They advance with steady, mechanical precision, indifferent to the storm of bullets. Their attacks earn the name waves, and rightly so. First surge the grenadiers, seasoned shock troops clad in heavier armor and armed to rupture fortifications or enemy trenches. Close behind roll successive tides of regular infantry, hundreds of guardsmen in heavy greatcoats, las rifles leveled, bayonets gleaming, moving as a single, inexorable machine. Imagine the defender's view. After days of shelling, half your comrades dead or deaf, the smoke clears and those masked figures rise from the haze, unstoppable as the tide. You've endured 3 days of unbroken shelling. Half your comrades lie dead, deaf, or shivering deep in the bunker. Suddenly, the bombardment ceases. Peering over the parapet of your trench, you glimpse them. Ranks of figures in ragged greatcoats and blank gas masks, pushing through smoke and drifting fog, clambering over craters and torn barbed wire with unhurried, dreadful resolve. You fire, cutting down scores. They do not falter. Step by step, they keep advancing, treading across the fallen as though the dead were paving stones. Some seem to murmur a low chant, perhaps that grim litany of sacrifice, and the sound chills the blood. It feels less like resisting soldiers than repelling an army of the dead, beings untouched by fear or pain. When the Death Korps finally surge into the trench or breach the fortification, the battle turns savage and intimate. Grenades arc into bunkers, combat blades and sharpened entrenching tools flash in the gloom. Among their favored instruments is the flamer, a weaponized torrent of fire ideal for driving foes from tunnels and dugouts. Eyewitnesses speak of still darker methods, such as burning phosphates that cling and consume without end. Ugly, yes, but lethally efficient. For the Death Korps, every engagement boils down to a single, Brutal equation. Seize the position, whatever the price in blood. If a single assault collapses, the Death Korps will launch it again and again until the position is seized or every soldier has fallen. The concept of retreat simply does not exist for them unless a superior officer issues an explicit order. This iron resolve, while formidable, can cut both ways. More than once, Krieg formations have continued an assault long after strategy dictated a halt, driven forward only because no one had told them to stop. Quitting is alien to their nature. To keep such relentless momentum from turning disastrous, each regiment carries attached commissars, yet their role within the Corps is strikingly reversed from the norm. Across the wider Imperial Guard, a commissar's purpose is to stiffen spines, prevent panic, execute cowards, and ensure obedience through fear. Among the Kriegers, panic is never the threat. These soldiers will fight and die without hesitation. Instead, the commissar becomes a brake rather than a whip, compelled at times to hold eager troops back from suicidal charges. Acting as tactical counselors and measured voices of reason, they work to cool the officer's willingness to sacrifice every man for a trivial objective. Ironically, a commissar may find himself bellowing, "Hold your positions, you fools," at warriors otherwise intent on dying to the last. And true to form, the Death Korps obey, proving that their discipline is as unyielding in restraint as it is in attack. Obedience defines them. One can almost picture a weary commissar shaking his head in disbelief as he urges these guardsmen not to throw their lives away needlessly. Yet an even darker facet of Krieg warfare lies in how they manage the wounded, both their own and those of others. This responsibility belongs to a singular figure within each regiment, the quartermaster. A Death Korps quartermaster is at once medic, supply officer, and somber battlefield priest, and his concept of healing is as pitiless as the world that shaped him. Accompanied by servitors and aides, he moves across the killing fields during and after combat, reclaiming weapons and assessing the fallen. If a wounded trooper can be swiftly mended and returned to the line, the quartermaster acts without hesitation, binding wounds or injecting powerful stimulants to push the soldier back into the fray. But if the injuries are catastrophic, an arm torn away with life bleeding out, a rent radiation suit exposing the body to fatal contamination, no effort will be squandered on futile rescue. Instead, the stricken guardsman receives what they call the Emperor's Peace, a quick, dignified execution delivered by bolt pistol or lethal injection. A brief invocation to the God Emperor is murmured as the soul is commended, and then the work turns practical. Every reusable item, rifle, ammunition, identification tags, is stripped from the corpse to equip the next warrior. To outsiders, this practice borders on the monstrous, but to the Death Korps, it is simple necessity. An efficient and sacred duty in a war where compassion must bow to survival and service. To the Death Korps, a soldier who can no longer fight is already dead, and scarce resources cannot be squandered on someone beyond combat use. Better to grant him an honorable end and pass his rifle to the next man than to bleed supplies on a futile rescue. For ordinary guardsmen, witnessing such practices is chilling. In many campaigns, Allied regiments have recoiled in horror as quartermasters executed grievously wounded soldiers whom other medics struggled to save, declaring the injuries too severe for redemption. One especially macabre tale lingers on the edges of truth. After a brutal engagement, a watchmaster, roughly a sergeant, was seen methodically draining the blood of mortally wounded comrades, likely to preserve it for transfusion or some other grim necessity. When shocked guardsmen confronted him, the Krieger reportedly replied with cold finality, Waste nothing. The Emperor's currency must be spent wisely. Whether the quote is literal or apocryphal, it perfectly distills their philosophy. Nothing is too grisly if it serves the war. All these traits, their relentless assaults, immovable defenses, and pitiless efficiency, make the Death Korps both devastatingly effective and profoundly unsettling partners. Even within the already merciless Imperium, there are voices that deem them excessive. A telling example lies in their clash with the Salamanders. On the world of Hesfair Seed, where the Imperium battled a separatist uprising, the Salamanders, Adeptus Astartes, renowned for their concern for civilians and comparatively humane methods, fought beside several Imperial Guard formations, among them the Death Korps. What followed would highlight the gulf between compassion and Krieg's unforgiving creed, setting the stage for a confrontation not just of armies, but of starkly different visions of war. Captain Xuanlo of the Salamanders pressed for a surgical assault meant to sever the rebel chain of command, then extend an offer of clemency to those who survived and chose to lay down their arms. His intent was clear. The ringleaders would be punished without mercy, but those willing to surrender could still live. A rare shard of compassion amid the endless wars of the Imperium. True to their long-held creed, the Salamanders sought to spare civilians and even defeated fighters whenever possible, at least by the harsh calculus of the Adeptus Astartes. The Death Korps of Krieg, however, embraced a far bleaker doctrine. To them, rebellion demanded obliteration. If a populace dared to rise, the only answer was to erase every trace of defiance so that no one would ever dream of rebellion again. Every insurgent would be executed, countless bystanders sacrificed as collateral, and entire cities leveled until nothing but ash and rubble remained. Such diametrically opposed visions of war bred inevitable conflict between the allies. During one brutal phase of the campaign, Xuanlo and his battle brothers were combing through a vast HAB block, a colossal hive-style apartment stack, methodically purging insurgents, capturing a few alive, and striving to spare any innocents trapped within. The Krieg command judged the same structure a nest of sedition and chose speed over subtlety. Without warning, they unleashed a massive artillery strike, reducing the entire complex to wreckage, even as the Salamanders still fought inside its steel and ferrocrete heart. The structure collapsed in a roaring inferno, burying everyone within. Rebels and hapless civilians alike were crushed, and nearly an entire Salamander squad was entombed with them. Yet Space Marines are forged for survival, and the Salamanders are famed for endurance beyond belief. Bruised and scorched but unbroken, Captain Xuanlo and his warriors clawed their way from the wreckage, fury burning hotter than the flames behind them. To him, the artillery strike was not merely reckless. It was an unforgivable betrayal of coordination and a callous gamble with the lives of his brothers and the innocents they had struggled to shield. The moment he emerged, Xuanlo stormed straight to the Krieg commander. What followed could scarcely be called a conversation. The Salamander captain, a towering 8-foot giant clad in scarred emerald ceramite, unleashed a thunderous tirade while the officer stood stiff and silent, a grim statue beneath the verbal onslaught. Veteran guardsmen nearby witnessed a sight they had never imagined. Seasoned Krieg officers, men who faced death sentences without a blink, showing unmistakable unease, even fear, as the Astartes' wrath bore down on them. It seemed that even the most unyielding of Krieg soldiers could sense when a Space Marine might quite literally tear them apart. In the aftermath, the campaign shifted decisively under Salamander command. The Death Korps, their resentment hidden behind respirator masks, reined in their brutal excesses and followed orders. When at last the separatist uprising was crushed, The alliance dissolved in an icy silence. Both forces parting ways with cold hostility lingering like smoke over a battlefield. The Salamanders, among the most humane of the Emperor's gene-forged warriors, were horrified by Krieg's merciless doctrine, while the Kriegers dismissed the Salamanders as dangerously sentimental. It was a collision of worldviews, iron-hearted pragmatism versus principled restraint. What makes the contrast remarkable is that even within the grim Imperium, a realm hardly known for mercy, the Death Korps are notorious for their unmatched severity. When an Astartes who has incinerated heretics without hesitation can look at you and mutter, "You might be taking it too far," you know you've claimed a dark and singular reputation. With their origins and philosophy laid bare, it's time to examine the brutal campaigns that define them. Chief among these is the infamous Siege of Vrax. Vrax was no ordinary outpost, but an entire planet functioning as an imperial armory. A colossal munitions storehouse that degenerated into an apocalyptic charnel ground. The spark came from Cardinal Zaffin, a senior ecclesiarch who turned renegade. From his power base on Vrax, he inflamed the populace with anti-imperial sermons and proclaimed the world independent. Because Vrax was saturated with war material, its defection was intolerable to the High Lords of Terra. Yet reclaiming it would be anything but simple. The rebels were heavily armed and entrenched behind formidable fortifications. The Herculean task of reconquest fell to the Death Korps, spearheading the 88th Siege Army. A colossal host of over 30 regiments and tens of thousands of soldiers commanded by Lord Commander Dwelke. If any force could wage a war of attrition fit for hell itself, it was Krieg's dour sons. Still, even they could not foresee the inferno that awaited. A campaign so protracted and murderous that it would etch the name Vrax into the darkest annals of Imperial military history. The Siege of Vrax dragged on for 17 standard years of unrelenting slaughter. 17 years, a span longer than many entire Imperial crusades. Upon landing, the Death Korps encircled the planet's immense citadel with vast siege lines, confronting fortifications that had been layered to the absolute limit. Vrax bristled with trench labyrinths, reinforced bunkers, minefields, and artillery emplacements, while the renegades possessed millions of shells and weapons to keep every bastion deadly. What followed was trench warfare in its most nightmarish form. The Death Korps would pound a sector with artillery, storm the shattered line, claim a few bloody yards, only to meet another hardened redoubt and repeat the grinding cycle. Vrax itself was built as concentric rings of defenses, and each had to be chewed apart, one after the next. Advancing soldiers excavated their own trenches and dugouts as they moved, transforming the surface into a scarred wasteland of craters, chemical muck, and corpse-filled ditches. The savagery defied belief. Both armies unleashed chemical weapons without restraint. Clouds of choking toxins and corrosive gas rolled endlessly over the killing fields. The Krieg regiments, sealed in their respirator suits, pressed forward undeterred, while countless Vraxian rebels perished in agony. Yet they retaliated in kind, firing their own gas shells back into the Krieg lines. Overhead, the sky was a perpetual blackened shroud from ceaseless bombardment, and the soil itself turned poisonous from the endless rain of death. It was war in its most absolute form, a 17-year crucible where nothing remained untouched by decay and annihilation. And the nightmare deepened. After years of unending combat, the corruption of chaos seeped ever stronger into Vrax. Cardinal Zaffin himself fell fully to its lure, whispered to be a chosen pawn of Nurgle, the plague god. He proclaimed a blasphemous holy war against the Imperium and summoned allies from the warp. Soon the battlefield crawled with heretical space marines, traitor Astartes from numerous Chaos legions, who slipped through the void to reinforce the uprising. Warbands such as the World Eaters, corn-worshipping berserkers drunk on slaughter, and the Alpha Legion, consummate masters of infiltration and deception, joined the fray. For the weary Imperial Guard, already bled white by years of attrition, the arrival of Chaos Space Marines was a soldier's worst dread made flesh. The traitors did not stop there. Dark rituals called forth demonic horrors, many sworn to Nurgle's festering power. Among them loomed Uraka, a hideous demon prince who in mortal life had been a corrupt cardinal, now reborn as a swollen, pestilent abomination. With hell itself breaking onto the field, the Imperium escalated in turn. The Inquisition dispatched the Grey Knights, its most secretive and specialized demon hunting chapter, to Vrax. Loyalist Space Marine forces, including the Dark Angels and the Red Scorpions, also committed elite strike teams to annihilate critical objectives, like the Rebel Command Bunker. By the campaign's grim final years, the Death Korps faced not merely mortal insurgents, but superhuman Chaos Marines and warp-spawned fiends, fighting a war that had descended fully into the demonic heart of the Long War. And yet, they never wavered. The Death Korps fell in unimaginable numbers, but their lines never fractured. Whenever a trench segment was overrun by the blood-drunk World Eaters, towering 8-foot berserkers swinging roaring chain axes, the Krieg soldiers counterattacked without hesitation, retaking ground in brutal hand-to-hand combat. When a great unclean one of Nurgle oozed from the warp, trailing pestilence and decay, they stood their ground and poured last fire into the monstrosity until it finally collapsed. Even when smallpox-like plague swept through their ranks, they kept fighting until bodies literally failed. This relentless, machine-like endurance kept the siege alive long enough for Imperial reinforcements to shift the tide. In the waning years of the campaign, Imperial forces finally breached Vrax's central citadel. The renegade Cardinal Zaffin met his end. Some reports speak of a Vindicare assassin's perfect shot, others of a Space Marine blade, or even the very demons he had once served. Accounts differ, but his death was certain. The remaining traitor armies were hunted down and annihilated or scattered into the void. Vrax was at last declared pacified in the year 830 of M41. But the price of victory was staggering beyond comprehension. Over 14 million Imperial Guardsmen perished in the siege of Vrax, most of them soldiers of Krieg. 14 million lives spent to reclaim a single world. To grasp the scale, that is a greater number than the entire population of many Imperial planets. And those figures count only the dead of the Imperium. The traitors almost certainly suffered losses on the same colossal scale, though Chaos keeps no ledgers of the dead and demons file no casualty reports. By war's end, nearly every inch of Vrax lay uninhabitable, choked with toxins, strewn with bones, and buried under mountains of wreckage. For most armies, such devastation would be unthinkable. But for the Death Korps, it was the ultimate vindication of their grim creed. Victory had been purchased precisely as doctrine demanded, through relentless attrition and unflinching sacrifice. A macabre jest spread afterward claimed that with Vrax avenged, the Emperor must surely have pardoned Krieg's ancient heresy. After all, what greater atonement could they offer? Yet ask a Krieger, and you'd hear only quiet denial. In their eyes, no tally of the dead can ever settle that ancient debt. They will always volunteer, or more accurately be conscripted, for the next crucible of blood. And volunteer they have. Since Vrax, the Death Korps have bled on innumerable fronts, one of the most infamous being the Third War for Armageddon. when the Orc warlord Gazgul Thraka unleashed his massive Wa. Against the polluted Forge world, 5 Krieg regiments were dispatched to bolster its defenses. Armageddon was its own nightmare. A furnace world poisoned by centuries of industry and crawling with billions of savage greenskins. There, amid the ash wastes and within the towering hive cities, the Death Korps fought shoulder to shoulder with the Armageddon Steel Legion, matching their grim reputation against endless tides of Orks in yet another war where survival meant nothing and sacrifice was everything. For the Kriegers, battling Orks may have felt almost refreshing. At last, they faced an enemy that welcomed the meat grinder with equal zeal. An opponent who would hurl endless waves forward until either side lay dead. In a bleak symmetry, the Death Korps and the Orks seemed made for one another. Neither force capable of retreat or surrender. On Armageddon, this grim kinship played out in full. The Krieg regiments sealed breaches in the defensive lines, mounted fierce counterattacks to reclaim lost sectors, and astonished allies with their tireless ferocity. When the campaign finally ground to a halt, the Orks still infested the planet, but their great offensive had been decisively blunted. The Death Korps, as expected, paid for every yard with dreadful casualties. Yet every position assigned to them was held to the last. Their grim service did not end with greenskins. They have also faced far stranger horrors. Consider the Tyranids, extragalactic swarms of bioengineered predators that consume every living thing. On worlds like Tarsus Ultra, when a Tyranid hive fleet descended, the Death Korps entrenched alongside defenders and met the oncoming nightmare. They held their trenchworks against living tides of chitin and claw, where each charge felt like drowning in a sea of teeth. Legends of the Battle of Tarsus Ultra tell of Krieg regiments fighting shoulder to shoulder with Ultramarines, those superhuman Astartes, and local planetary defense forces. Even as monstrous biotitans smashed through their barricades, the Kriegers stood fast, absorbing losses in silence before summoning reserves and launching relentless counterstrikes until the alien waves broke. One witness remarked that the Death Korps fought the Tyranids as if facing mortal foes. Layered volleys of masked lasgun fire, followed by brutal bayonet charges. Strangely enough, it worked. At least long enough for the Space Marines to execute their own decisive strikes. The Tyranids anticipated terror. The Kriegers possessed none. Among their most punishing campaigns was the Orpheus War against the Necrons. These ancient, soulless androids wielded weapons capable of reducing a human body to atoms in seconds, and far worse, they could self-repair. Blast a Necron apart and it might simply phase out and reassemble elsewhere unless utterly annihilated. Late in the 41st millennium, vast Necron hosts stirred in the Orpheus sector and began systematically eradicating Imperial colonies. To stem the onslaught, the Imperium dispatched 2 full armies, millions of soldiers, into what became the Orpheus War. Their grim mission to delay the mechanical tide until greater reinforcements could arrive. The conflict was a waking nightmare. In open engagements, Necron phalanxes scythed down charging guardsmen with effortless precision. And even when one of the Xenos constructs fell, it often vanished only to rise again. Yet the Death Korps, true to form, answered with the same cold determination. Charge regardless. Keep firing until the machine stayed dead. Early assaults exacted horrifying losses. Entire regiments disintegrated in the attempt to storm Necron lines head-on. But the Krieg regiments were not automatons. Hard experience forged adaptation. They studied the enemy's rhythms and began combining tactics, learning how to break the seemingly immortal legions through relentless pressure and calculated maneuvers. The Death Korps perfected a brutal method against the Necrons. Massive, long-range artillery barrages to pummel the advancing machines. Though Necrons could eventually reassemble, the relentless shelling could shatter their ranks, bury them beneath rubble, or at least disable them long enough to strike. Once the bombardment left the enemy staggering, Krieg infantry surged forward in close assault, knowing that even these undying constructs could be overwhelmed if enough human bodies pressed in with bayonets and grenades. One of the most decisive clashes came at the Battle of Amara Prime, where the Death Korps deliberately sacrificed multiple regiments in a slow, grinding fighting withdrawal. Their unflinching bloodletting stalled the Necron advance to a crawl, buying precious time for the Minotaur's chapter of Space Marines to strike deep, decapitate the enemy command network, and annihilate key overlords directing the offensive. Strategically, it was a clear victory. Tactically, it was a nightmare of carnage. Exactly the kind of Pyrrhic triumph the Death Korps accepts as routine. By war's end, Imperial analysts calculated losses exceeding 60%. Yet their grim obstinacy achieved the goal. The Necron expansion was checked and eventually contained. True to form, the Death Korps once more proved willing to trade lives for survival, a grim constant even in the current age of greater chaos. When the galaxy itself is split by the colossal rift of the Cicatrix Maledictum, they remain the Imperium's blunt, unyielding instrument in apocalyptic wars. During the desperate defense of the Nachmund Gauntlet, a vital corridor through the Great Rift, over 100 Krieg regiments were hurled into the fire to hold doomed worlds, plugging breaches in reality with their own flesh. And as ever, they marched into that fate without hesitation, seeing annihilation itself as duty fulfilled. In the ongoing Octarius War, a nightmarish three-way conflict between Orks and Tyranids first engineered, then bitterly regretted by the Imperium, the Death Korps of Krieg are deeply committed to containing the chaos. Only they would willingly march into a killing ground, teeming with billions of rampaging greenskins and ravenous biohorrors, attempting to stem a tide that by every measure cannot be stopped. It is the ultimate no-win scenario, yet nothing in their nature allows retreat. Across every campaign, certain truths never waver. The Death Korps obey without hesitation. They absorb losses that would shatter any other army. They fight on until either victory is achieved or every last soldier lies dead. Among the Imperial Guard, there is an old saying: if something must be held, send in the Cadians. If something must be seized, send in the Catacons. If something must be erased from existence regardless of cost, send in the Kriegers. Grim though it sounds, the adage is accurate. The Death Korps embody the farthest extreme of the Guard's creed that human life is the Emperor's coin. They will spend that currency by the million to secure a single objective. Yet their slaughter is anything but mindless. It is conducted with cold, deliberate precision. A methodical sacrifice honed into an art. Dying for the Emperor is not simply duty to them. It is a science perfected. In the end, the Death Korps of Krieg remain the Imperium's ultimate engine of attrition, transforming the certainty of death itself into a weapon of victory. They are dreaded by enemies, respected and sometimes quietly feared by allies, and wholly devoted to a cause they accept will demand their lives in full. In the grim darkness of the far future, where endless war is the only constant, the Death Korps of Krieg have found their true calling. They belong at the very edge of battle, where combat is most savage and life is measured in heartbeats. To them, existence itself is merely the chance to earn redemption through ultimate sacrifice. If victory demands every drop of blood and every shred of flesh, they will surrender it willingly. For Krieg's ancient sin still weighs heavy. and only through the final currency of their own deaths can they hope to balance the Emperor's scales.